Chapter 4. The Back of the Bus. How Randy loved the cupola. In it she seemed to be detached from the house and the world, floating aloft on a sea of branches. An army cot, an old rocking chair, and an empty toy chest were all the furniture it contained. Some day she planned to paint the ceiling, blue with gold stars on it, whole constellations, and a section of the Milky Way. She would have to lie on her back on a scaffolding to paint it, the way Father told her Michelangelo had lain on his back to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Probably she would never get around to doing it, but it was an inspiring thought. Today she was standing at her own west window, watching the road. Ever since lunch she had been standing there, for this was the day when their dear friend Mrs. Oliphant was to arrive in the antique station wagon, which she always called the motor, with a capital M. The children knew and were fond of the motor, though it was a difficult car to love, for they had spent the previous summer at Mrs. Oliphant's house by the sea, and had ridden in it often. It was a tall, narrow vehicle, fitted with regular four-paned windows that made it look like a greenhouse on wheels, and was further distinguished by a small length of pipe sticking up from the roof, chimney-wise, to release the evil fumes of the exhaust. Randy remained at her post like Sister Anne, and at 4 o'clock was rewarded by being the first to see the motor rattling conservatively down the drive. It would not be hurried. It was like a self-willed old mule. Nothing in creation could make it alter its pace. "Here she comes, kids!" shouted Randy, flinging herself recklessly down the ladder steps that led to the office. The answering thunder of descending footsteps and shouts of joy reached her from the hall stairs. Father burst out of his study. Cuffy burst out of the kitchen. The front door was hurled open and left that way. The station wagon rumbled haughtily to a stop. Mrs. Oliphant emerged and was engulfed by enthusiastic Melendi children. She was an old, lively lady, tall, dark-browed, and adorned with many furs, many necklaces, and brooches. The whole family loved Mrs. Oliphant. She was kind and funny and original. She carried with her the memory of a long life starred with adventures, and you had the feeling that, old though she was, still more adventures lay ahead of her. "Are you tired, Mrs. O?" said Father. He always called her Mrs. O. "Not so tired as the motor," replied Mrs. Oliphant, looking solicitously at the station wagon. "Now that I've given it to you, I don't think it's going to last very long. You must use it carefully. After all, it's very old. It may give up the ghost at any minute." The children stared at the car with the respect due to an elder. "But in case it does give up the ghost," Mrs. Oliphant said frivolously, "I have supplied the children with other means of locomotion. It would be dreadful if they were forced to miss a single minute more of school. Look in the back of the motor." Oliver got there first. He opened the rear door and leaned in. "Oh, boy," he said quietly. "Two-wheelers! 4 of them! Oh, boy!" Rush and Mona and Randy pushed against him, peering into the station wagon. It was true. "Bicycles!" shouted Randy, rather obviously. "How absolutely divine!" said Mona. Next to revolting, it was her favorite word. All Rush could think of to say was, "Gosh." He searched around in his mind for something more eloquent and added, "Gee." "Mrs. O, you shouldn't have," objected Father. "It's too much." But she just waved him away. "You and Cuffy will have to walk, I'm afraid, but that will be good for your figures." She put her arm through Father's and looked up at the house. "Well, Martin," she said to Mr. Melendi, "it looks strong and comfortable, but rather broad-shouldered for its height, don't you think?" "That's why it's called the 4-story mistake," Rush told her. "The what?" Mrs. Oliphant stopped walking and stared at him. "That's its name," Rush told her, and the whole thing had to be explained again. "It's a nice story, and a nice name," Mrs. Oliphant decided. "A much better name for a house than the usual kinds, like Hillcrest, or Bayview, or Casa Loma, or Shangri-La. She began to laugh as she looked at Oliver. During the whole conversation, as they moved toward the house, he had been walking backward in front of her. Walking is not the word, however. He was hopping, fidgeting, and jumping from one foot to the other, and staring into her face with an expression of agonized pleading. "What's the matter, Oliver?" said the old lady. "Please, Mrs. Oliphant, could we practice now on the two-wheelers?" he begged. "By all means," she agreed. "You children stay outside and practice, and we will go indoors, far away from the windows where it's safe. Remember, I am not to be held responsible for any fractures or concussions." Rush and Mona had ridden before. In no time at all, after a few preliminary lurchings, they were speeding showily around the circle in the drive, zigzagging across the lawn between the trees, and coasting down the side of the hill.